This week we learned that BBC presenter Huw Edwards was named by his wife as the presenter at the centre of the BBC scandal.
It has since been announced that the BBC Director General, Tim Davie, will be questioned in Parliament about the corporation's leadership following the Huw Edwards furore and their handling of the scandal itself.
Joining us to discuss this is former BBC executive and presenter Roger Bolton. Roger, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to join us. Do you believe that this has been handled well by the BBC and in particular the Director General of the BBC?
I'll give you a yes and no answer. I think the Director General has handled it exceptionally well once he knew about it. And the key question is, when did he know and why didn't he know earlier? But I think there are rather more questions to be asked by people like you, frankly, and the Sun. Let me quote Lee Anderson, one of your deputy chairman of the Conservative Party. The BBC is a safe haven for perverts. And we've had lots of MPs in Parliament saying, name the person or whatever, on the basis of what evidence? I think we've seen a rush to judgment in Parliament. And the Sun hasn't shown us any significant evidence for what it said or put its editor to be interviewed. So we've had loads of speculation and very little reporting. What we do need now from the BBC is a complete account, when it's done, of what happened when, and then it should be scrutinised. We have a right to know, but we don't necessarily have a right to know now. And what we need overall is a bit more reporting and a bit less speculation.
Roger, fair point. How do people know? Did Tim Davie know quick enough? How good is that process within the BBC? But I think people were looking for a fairness of how the BBC has covered things. So let's go back to maybe Lord McAlpine. It saw off a DG there, George Entwistle. How about the way the BBC handled the Cliff Richard case there, an innocent man? So I think people will say the BBC looks after its own, which it's done in the past. Martin Bashir, what went on in the past, maybe even going further back, and here with Huw Edwards, but quick to point the finger at other people. So can you understand people's concern about how quick they are to point the finger at others, but not at their own?
No, I don't understand that. What you've just outlined are a number of scandals in which the BBC made big mistakes.
Exactly.
Martin.
And this could be another big mistake by how badly it's been handled.
No, this is over about 20 years, maybe, and with the amount of broadcasting the BBC do, the number of channels, whatever, it makes far fewer mistakes than almost any other organisation. And in reporting itself in this occasion, it's been far more open, although I think it's overdone it. I think it's got a bit self-obsessed. But I think the problem with all this is the rush to judgment.
Yes, I agree. I agree.
The proper questions to be asked about how quickly the BBC responded. But this is not a BBC scandal in the sense that we've had some in the past. This is not an institution trying to protect itself. This is not an institution covering up. It's done that in the past. It isn't doing it now. And by the way, if you're going to take on the BBC, how about taking on the Sun? How about taking on the Mail? How about taking on people like Lee Anderson? The BBC, a safe haven for perverts?
Roger Bolton, for somebody who comes from Liverpool, I think we did take on the Sun, and I think you know that.
We're delighted. We're delighted that
Mike. Talking about a safe haven for perverts, the Conservative Party in particular, or MPs as a whole, should be just a little careful. People are peculiar.
Roger, we'll try and come back to you in a second, but we've got Michael Crick, who's looks as if he might be doing the weather forecast as well as commenting on the BBC as well. Michael, I particularly was interested that the Newsnight appeared to be doing an investigation into Huw Edwards before even the Sun's article was published. That's what's been reported in the papers. As a former Newsnight political editor, what do you make of the BBC, in effect, investigating its own people rather than reporting it to the management?
Well, I think what I hear happened is that Victoria, Derbyshire was an event a few days before the Sun story broke, and somebody said, well, what about Huw Edwards? And she did start asking around, but to whether to say it was a full-scale investigation, I'm not sure that's the case. And, if somebody said that to you at a party about one of your colleagues, you might ask a few questions of other colleagues. I mean, I think overall, the BBC has mishandled quite a lot of this, and particularly the original complaint made by the parents of the person concern, and I think BBC managers have effectively admitted that they were slow to respond, and indeed if they had responded properly and had been more dogged in the handling the complaint, then it may never have got to the pages of the Sun. Having said that, the Sun didn't handle it as properly as they should have done, in my view. They failed to take the denial of the young person concerned when they WhatsApped the Sun the night before it was published. They didn't include that denial, and indeed if they had included that denial, I think that would have considerably reduced the effect of the story and the weight of the story. So both sides haven't really handled this very well, and I think, like Roger, that it's time now to step back a bit and let processes take their course. I mean, poor Huw Edwards is, in hospital, is clearly in a bad way, and it's going to be difficult for the BBC to conduct their inquiry properly so long as he's in hospital. But that inquiry has to be carried out, and the Sun the Sun newspaper has got to look into what it's done, and so forth. But I think a period of quietness all round would be a good thing. I mean, it goes against my instincts to say that as a journalist, but you've got to remember, these are human beings, not just Huw Edwards and his wife and his family, but also the people who've, the young person concerned, their parents, the other people who've seemed to have made complaints. All of these are human beings, and we've got to remember that. And sometimes I think, as journalists, we don't always remember that. And I think this is a case in point.
Roger, just quickly, if you can, the point that Michael made there about the fact that, the BBC received this complaint from the parents, and it took 7 weeks before that allegation was apparently put to Huw Edwards. I mean, surely by anybody's standards, that isn't handling a situation very well, is it?
Well, that's a big question mark. I agree with you. By the way, I often kick the BBC. I quite enjoy doing it, actually. But I'm not going to kick them that hard on this occasion. But let me say this. We don't know what the original allegation was. We don't know to whom it was put. The BBC says there are about 250 of these things going around any one time. This doesn't excuse the fact that if you mentioned Huw Edwards, you'd have thought, whoops, hey, better red flag this. But what I think you can say, and there are legitimate questions to be asked there, what you can say is once this DG found out about it, he acted very well. By the way, I think on Tuesday, the problem is going to be when he appears before the Lords Committee, is he probably won't have finished all his investigation. Yeah. So what can he say? And he's got to protect the family. He's got to protect you. All you can say is the BBC has, in some ways, been more than open in reporting itself.
Roger Bolton,
agree with
thank you for joining us today, and Michael Crick as well. And the one thing that I totally agree...
Two of the best of the BBC.
Absolutely. And what I agreed with Roger Bolton, we shouldn't be so quick to jump to judgment now.